What if this is the last new iPhone?
We're so excited you could join us today for some big announcements.
The titanium iPhone 15 Pro.
We've become accustomed to Apple dropping a new iPhone every September with a better camera, a new battery, and a faster processor. The iPhone is the most successful consumer product in history and has put Apple in an unbelievable economic position. The company boasts a balance sheet of over $200 billion and a loyal base of customers that are increasingly locked in to their ecosystem of devices. However, from Steve Jobs' heyday through Tim Cook's reign as CEO, there is one variable in Apple's business strategy that neither leader has ever had to deal with: major conflict in East Asia. Xi Jinping, the authoritarian leader of China, has one geopolitical goal that supersedes all other objectives: recapturing Taiwan under Chinese rule. If China were to launch an invasion of Taiwan, it would be absolutely devastating for the region, the global economy, and Apple. Despite making more than $380 billion a year and being worth over $2.7 trillion, Apple is extremely vulnerable to supply chain disruptions in China.
Taiwan is a thriving democracy and a crucial link in global supply chains, particularly for advanced semiconductors.
In this video, we'll break down why Apple is screwed if China invades Taiwan and how Apple might try to respond to this crisis. But first, I need to quickly acknowledge that this is not a sure thing. The chance of China invading Taiwan is not 100%, but it's also not 0%. Here's what we know. Xi has stated that reunification with Taiwan is one of his top goals. The CCP has attempted to accomplish this by sponsoring propaganda in Taiwanese elections, flying fighter jets in Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and pressuring other countries to isolate them diplomatically. China is also really active on their side of the Taiwan Strait. In Fujian province, which is right by Taiwan, they are building the world's largest combat hospital, 18 new air raid shelters, and upgrading their existing air bases. They've also run large-scale simulations of a Taiwan invasion in both August of 2022 and April of 2023. So whether the probability of an invasion is 5%, 30%, or 70%, it would be wise to model this as a risk factor for one of the world's largest and most profitable companies, because the odds of it happening are definitely not zero. Apple began designing its own A-series chips for iPads, iPhones, and Apple Watches in 2010, and switched its Mac computers from Intel semiconductors to Apple-designed M-series chips in 2020. The key point here is that they design the chips, but they don't produce them. And in fact, there's only one place in the world capable of manufacturing the world's most advanced semiconductors, and it's located right here in China and Taiwan. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company has 2 fabrication plants based in Tainan capable of producing chips using 3-nanometer process technology. In the context of semiconductor manufacturing, a 3-nanometer process refers to the ability to create transistors that are 3 nanometers wide, which is very small. To put it in perspective, a human hair is about 80,000 or 100,000 nanometers wide. So 3 nanometers is about the width of 2 silicon atoms. Other objects that are about that size include a strand of DNA, a virus, a single gold atom, a red blood cell, or the smallest bacteria that we can identify. This size makes the chips more powerful and energy efficient. It is an enormous feat of engineering, like building a skyscraper on a postage stamp. And understandably, the facilities that can do this take billions of dollars and years to build. Those bleeding-edge chips go into advanced weapon systems, artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, and cutting-edge smartphones. And Apple is by far TSMC's largest customer. They account for 23% of the Taiwanese chip makers' $72 billion in annual revenue. If a military invasion of Taiwan were to occur, these facilities would be destroyed, potentially by missiles, or invading soldiers, or Taiwanese political leaders. See, the last thing Taiwan would want is for TSMC to fall under control of the CCP, the most ruthless authoritarian regime in the world, controlling the globe's most advanced semiconductor technology would be a recipe for disaster. And even if they weren't destroyed, the engineers who know how to operate them would flee or refuse to produce them for the CCP. Regardless of these details, one thing is clear. Apple's annual upgrade cycles would look very different. Would you pay to upgrade your iPhone if the latest model's chip was the same or slower than the one you already had? No way. TSMC started construction of its first US-based chip plant in Arizona in 2021. The company had originally planned to start production at the plant in 2024, but it has since delayed that timeline to 2025 due to a shortage of skilled labor. TSMC is also planning to build a second chip plant in Arizona, which is scheduled to begin production in 2026. But the company has not yet announced a start date for construction of that plant. In the best case scenario, these facilities would begin to produce 5nm chips 2 years from now. And 5nm chips are what's in the iPhone 12. For reference, Apple sold 225 million iPhones in 2022, and just 1/3 of them were iPhone 12s. Every modern phone needs a modern chip, and every iPhone needs to move through Apple's supply chain. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the West responded with an enormous sanctions regime. Financial assets were frozen, Russian exports were put under harsh controls, and Western allies banned companies from selling military-grade products to Putin's war machine. But Russia is mostly a commodity-based economy. They sell oil, grow grain, mine different metals, and produce chemicals for stuff like fertilizer. China's economy is much more reliant on manufacturing. So if they committed an act of aggression against Taiwan, that's where a sanctions regime would be targeted. 17% of Apple's suppliers are domiciled in China, operating 2,360 facilities across the country. That makes China the largest global source of Apple's supply chain after the United States. And this is interesting because the CCP blocks a lot of other American tech companies from doing business in China. Both Facebook and Google are blocked from the Chinese internet because they pose a threat to the Communist Party's control over their information environment. But Apple, on the other hand, provides the CCP with something they really want: economic prosperity. According to a 2021 report by the China Center for International Economic Exchanges, Apple's economic footprint in China supports over 2.8 million jobs, including direct employment at Apple's stores, offices, and manufacturing facilities, as well as indirect jobs in the supply chain. The report also found that Apple's operations in China had generated more than $700 billion in economic output and has contributed to the development of China's high-tech sector. In exchange for creating so many jobs, Apple gets to sell their products in the Chinese market. In its 2023 fiscal year, Apple's revenue from Greater China, which includes mainland, Macau, and Hong Kong, was $114 billion. This represents about 19% of Apple's total revenue for the year. So you gotta ask, how would those numbers be digested in the West if Taiwan was invaded? Because there was no hesitation to hammer Russia with economic sanctions. And additionally, dozens of multinational corporations pulled out of Russia voluntarily. Halliburton and Shell pulled out of joint ventures with Russia's largest oil company. IKEA closed all its Russian stores, and Unilever stopped selling products in Russian markets. Would the West boycott Apple if it continued to produce and sell products in China? I suspect they would. And you could also expect politicians to call for Apple to reshore jobs and production to places like Mexico in order to make its allegiances clear. Doing that would not be cheap, and it would not happen quickly. And if Apple took that move, would they still be able to sell $100 billion of products a year in China? Now look, there's a reason this is one of Apple's blind spots. Breaking into China was the #1 accomplishment that propelled Tim Cook to succeed Steve Jobs as Apple's CEO. As the company's chief operating officer from 2007 to 2011, Cook was responsible for overseeing international operations and frequently visited China. He worked with local partners to build factories and distribution centers and negotiated preferable tax rates from the Chinese government. Cook also hired Chinese executives to help run the business and invested in local advertising to promote Apple in China. When he became CEO in 2011, he continued to focus there. Apple's total revenue inside the country was less than $1 billion. So he opened a new Apple store in Beijing and their first retail store in Shanghai. Under Cook's leadership, Apple has become one of the most successful foreign companies in China. Remember, They make more than $100 billion per year there. It is basically impossible to have accomplished so much success and then consciously choose to unwind it. And even if he wanted to, could he? Imagine tomorrow, he walks into the office, shoots off a memo, and says, relocate production ASAP. Could other countries pick up the slack? Not immediately. Manufacturing the complex, cutting-edge products that Apple produces is not like replacing Lego blocks. Apple has dipped its toes into creating assembly lines in Brazil and India. And it's also offloaded the production of old iPhones to other places in Asia like Vietnam. But for cutting-edge smartphones, they still rely on enormous 300,000 person manufacturing facilities located in China. And even if they were able to effectively move their assembly lines elsewhere, they still wouldn't have those cutting-edge chips. So what's Apple going to do? Could they buy their way out of trouble? They do have those $200 billion on their balance sheet. Could they go acquire companies that would boost their portfolio, give them more hardware to sell, and potentially diversify where they're actually producing their goods? Two of the companies that people highlight most as potential Apple acquisition targets also produce their products in China and Taiwan. Peloton bikes are mostly assembled in Taiwan. Tesla produces an enormous amount of their cars in China. If they wanted to go after OpenAI, that company is mostly controlled by Microsoft. They'd never let that happen. And I don't really think that Apple wants to get into the world of buying and managing B2B software companies. Apple's most likely bet to try and retain some of its revenue, some of its profits, is to amp up its consumer software business. If you look at Apple's unique ecosystem, they do provide a number of services: Apple Pay, Apple TV Plus, and iCloud. They could raise prices or scale production, but that would also be really hard to do in the middle of a global recession induced by China's invasion of Taiwan. Remember, they're not the only company that's going to be affected. And at the end of the day, it isn't the software that makes people fall head over heels for Apple. They do have nice operating systems, but it is those cutting-edge physical products that everyone is most closely tied to. I do not envy Tim Cook and the executives at Apple. They have to walk a geopolitical tightrope, balancing their business between the West and China. One false move, like a Taiwan invasion, could have the whole thing come crashing down. Apple's economic entanglement with China is a double-edged sword. Yes, it brings in revenues, jobs, technological advancements, but it also leaves Apple vulnerable to sanctions, boycotts, and public shaming. Conflict over Taiwan would turn the present tech Cold War into a hot conflict, dividing the world into rival technological blocks. Companies like Apple would be forced to choose sides, and the globalized tech industry as we know it would never be the same. In the coming weeks, we'll be dropping a video with all the details about how China would invade Taiwan, including the 3 months that it would be most likely to occur. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and in the meantime, watch our video on how Steve Jobs took a ton of lessons for building Apple from the founder of Polaroid.